This is Beyond with Heather Tesch, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. Hello, my guest today is Nicole Kerr. Nicole, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, Heather, it's my privilege, and I'm just so full of gratitude to be on this show and talk about the important message that I have today. And so thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
You are so welcome. It's great to have you here. And also, it's great to have all of you listening. I really appreciate you being here as well. Nicole has a pretty incredible story. She had a near-death experience many years ago. So, Nicole, why don't you take us to the day of the accident and then lead us into your near-death experience?
Sure. So the day of the accident was a Sunday evening, August 28th, 1983. I was only 19 years old. And at that time, I was a cadet at our United States Air Force Academy. Now, you have to understand, my dad was military. I was raised in the South, very religious, very conservative. And I was into people pleasing, as a lot of us are at a young age. And I wanted to please my father. I had not one military bone in my body. I was a model. I did ballet. I did piano. I did nothing that would say Nicole's going to go into one of these service academies. If you looked at my whole growing up era. So I wanted to please him, and they had allowed women into the service academies back then. And so I applied, and to my shock, I got accepted. And when I got up there and went to boot camp, I knew instantly that this wasn't for me. And my soul, more importantly, knew it wasn't for me. Because as much as you want to think we all need military divisions, the soul is not designed to kill people and to deal with the horror and the trauma that incurs when you take another soul's life. So I knew that. And the issue for me was, in our family, I don't know about yours, Heather, but failure's not an option. Once you start something, you can't quit it. The humiliation, the embarrassment, the shame, the feeling of less than, not good enough. I couldn't live with that and feel like I disappointed my father and my congressman and everybody else. So I stayed. And even though it was abusive and it was not where I wanted to be and I was struggling, I still continued to go. And the beginning of my sophomore year, we were at a squadron event, and I was one of the last people to leave and got a ride back with the last person there. And he was a senior cadet. We got in his 1965 Corvette convertible, and he had a different agenda. And you have to know this about me. I had never been on a date in high school. And so I am all of a sudden at a school with 4,000 guys, and my dad's rules were no smoking and no drinking and no dating cadets. Well, I'm like, I'm in my sophomore year here. I'm going to have some fun, because fun was not part of our life growing up. And so, needless to say, his agenda was, let's go have a couple more beers, let's have a cigarette, let's make out, which I was like, oh boy, I didn't know all of that was going to be coming. I just wanted a ride back to the academy to start studying again. And so, needless to say, we did go to the bar. I did have a cigarette, first one in my life. And then when he started trying to make out, I said, no, that's the limit. And so we got back on the road again. And that was the last thing I remember until waking up in the ICU the next day. So I was, this is a picture for the audience to see. If you're, it's a 1965 red Corvette convertible. It did not have seatbelts. We were ejected out of the car, and it flipped over and landed on its top. So thank God we didn't have seatbelts at that time. But that's the passenger side of the car. And as the sheriff said, that car is unsurvivable. The driver had minimal damage. He was drunk, turns out later, and I was pronounced dead at the scene. And the reason I know that is because my EMT that arrived, it was a volunteer fire department that got the first call, and he lived about 2 miles away, but it took him about 10 minutes to get to me by the time some bystanders who heard the crash came out, checked me, checked the other guy, determined I was already expired, went in and got a blanket and covered me up. So there was about a 10-minute lag there where I was clinically dead. And what happened is my memory came back 19 years later. And you put my memory coming back with the hospital documentation, with my EMT's transcription of what happened. And he came to my hospital actually 10 weeks after the crash and told me what happened, because I had no memory, Heather. All I remember were bright white lights, and that was it. And for 19 years, that's all I remembered. I was given the story, by him, by the doctor, by the other people, the district attorney. I had the accident report, all of that, but I didn't have the memory. And so what I now know is when he started working on me, he couldn't get any sign of life except my right pupil dilating and flinching. And have you ever heard of the phrase, our eyes are the window to our soul?
Sure.
Okay, so what I now know is when I flew out of the car, I went butt up through the windshield and I got stuck up in the air. And at that moment, I looked down and I knew I was going to die. I knew it. And so I cried out to God to please help me. And at that moment, an angel came down and took me up to the other side. Now, in my book, I call him Casper the Friendly Ghost. I knew he was male. I knew he was in his 30s. I had all these descriptors, but I just didn't have a name except Casper. So I called him Casper for until I published the book a year and a half ago. And then as soon as the book released, my grandfather came to me and told me he was my angel. I smelled cigar smoke one day as I was writing in meditation, and I was like, what is that cigar smoke doing in the house? And then I heard, Nicole, this is your grandfather. And I had never heard that before. And I knew one of the common elements of NDEs is they usually go and see a deceased loved one comes and presents themselves along with the white light. And I had not had that experience, but here he comes. And he said, I saw what you were going through, the abuse that you were receiving at the academy, that you didn't want to be there. You didn't know how to quit. And he said, I came and took you away from all of that. And he said, I will be with you throughout the remainder of your life as your military angel and guard you and protect you until you pass away. And I was just floored that I now knew it was my grandfather. So that brings me comfort. And what's interesting is the guy that was in the car, the cadet, was an alcoholic, I later learned. And my granddaddy, when he was here on earth, was also an alcoholic. Now, when you transition, that doesn't carry over what you were here. But it's interesting that parallel happened, and he was 58 years old when he passed away from a massive heart attack. And I was 58 years old in mid-August, which is when he passed away. He said, now is the time for you to know you're the age that I was when I transitioned. So that to me is like, whoa.
And that was a harsh way to pull you out of the academy.
Yeah, I think back now, it's like, God, why didn't I just quit? But it just, the shame of it, I just couldn't, So anyhow, I later, John, the EMT, in fact, he's going to tell you a little bit of his story 40 years later of what he remembered. But I was just going in, when my soul came back in, when my eye did that, they got something called mass pants on me, and they got my blood pressure reading. It was 60/0. Now, blood pressure readings are more normally 120/80. So you can see at that level, I was just in and out of death. And then they did CPR all the way to the hospital, to the closest community hospital that was not equipped to deal with trauma. I had massive injuries, so much so that I was bleeding from the bone. There was no, there's no blood there. So their goal that night was just to stabilize me and keep me alive. And that's what they did.
In fact, let's go ahead and hear from the EMT who was on the scene.
Every time I talk every time I try to tell the story, I break down. We got to the scene, and there was a bunch of standbys next to one person that was covered with a blanket. And I said, I'll take this one and you go to the other one to my partner. So he went looking at the boy, and of course the boy had minimal problems. And I pulled the blanket up, and everybody said, "Oh, don't bother with her. She's already passed away. Go help your buddy." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I make these kind of decisions myself." And so I gave her a pain stimulus where you rub the sternum on the chest, and I saw her eyes blink.
Hello?
So I want to know how
It's okay. Take your time. Take a deep breath.
you want to know how it affected me. There you go. So I rubbed the check. I saw her eyes bleeding. I blinked, and I said, "I'm going to work her." So I started CPR on her. In the meantime, my buddy came back and helped me, along with my teenage boy doing whatever. One of the amazing things that I found, in spite of her ankle being partially amputated, and the cut was from her upper thigh on the inner thigh all the way down to her knee, with the white adipose fat tissue sticking out. There wasn't a drop of blood anywhere to be seen at that scene that I remember. So we got what was called in those days mass pants, which applies pressure to the lower extremities and forces the blood into the heart. I attribute that to helping save her life. We did CPR on the way to the hospital for a good 20 minutes, taking turns going back and forth. 20 minutes of CPR is pretty extraordinary.
Every time I talk to John or see John, I just break down in tears. I've stayed in touch with him for 40 years, along with my surgeon. And it has been an honor because he was a Navy SEAL. He was a tough, hard ass kind of guy. And to see him get so emotional about this, I just wanted, and I felt that you guys needed to see this because it does affect first responders and other people. It just isn't, another person. And I'm so grateful. He's one of my angels. I believe in angels. I believe they occur in many forms. And we have human angels as well as Casper the Ghost kind of angels on the other side. But he definitely was one of my angels that I talk about in the book as well. So I was in the hospital 4 months, rocky road. I tried to leave 2 more times. One time on the operating room, I was code blue, called the time of death, went and told my parents that I had expired. And within 2 minutes, my heart started up again. Heather, there's no explanation for that, except I remembered just 2 years ago in a triggering situation. And that's why this PTSD and trauma is really hard for people that have been on the other side to come back and live because they're transformed. And so I remembered leaving my body. I wanted to find that white light again. I wanted to go back to that sense of safety and peace and this cocooning, like I was in a chrysalis. I felt like an astronaut that was out in outer space full of awe and wonder, and nothing bad could ever happen to me again. And it was just brilliant. And it's a clear kind of white light that is enveloped that you're in. And I think that's the presence of God. And God is love and God is energy. But I went through a real harrowing 4 months of recovery and then 8 months of physical recovery to learn how to walk again and just do the functions of daily living. I was reduced back to infancy. I was totally dependent on my mother, and that brought up a whole nother issue of becoming codependent with her, which really plagued my life for many, many years. And that's such a tender age, 19, to have to think that you're on your own and you're independent and you can do things. And then all of a sudden, things that you took for granted that you were going to wake up healthy, it doesn't happen. And that's the truth about death. We never know when our last day on earth is going to be. And if we could actually live with that awareness, we would be more present, we'd be more kind to others, we'd be more loving, and we would live in a deeper, more meaningful way. And that is the truth. The massacre that happened in Maine recently, or going back to Sandy Hook, none of those people thought that that was going to be their last day to live, you know? And so, one of my messages is you have to start preparing for death, just like you do any other major life transition, whether it's getting married, whether it's having children, you prepare for that. So it's important that we start changing the narrative around death and talk about it positively. It's going to happen to all of us. Okay. It's the only single thing that is going to happen to every single person in terms of a shared experience. Used to be death and taxes, but a lot of people are getting out of paying taxes. So, we need to bring it out in the open, and we need to change the conversation and the vibration around it and get out of this death denial situation that we've been in.
Well, and a lot of people are very afraid of death, but tell us what you saw the moment that you felt yourself leave your body.
Okay, so 19 years later, I'm now working at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I just got on with my life, and I was sick a lot. I was dealing with chronic health problems. I was also having chronic mental issues. I just didn't know what they were at that time. And my father's and my family's way is you just plow through the trauma. We got through our trauma in life, so you should be able to, that's the kind of mindset that that generation, I think, has for the most part. So I went to Starbucks on my usual stop before I get into the office. And all of a sudden I remembered exactly in detail how I was sitting in the car. And I always wondered how I got the injuries that I did. And now I realized I had one foot up on the dashboard and the other foot crossed. So when I went up through the dashboard, I cut all of my rectal area. My foot was just hanging on by that much. I severed my wrist. I fractured my pelvis. I mean, multiple injuries. But I could never figure out, how did that particular injury happen? And that made complete sense to me. So I went to see my chiropractor and body worker instead of going to work. And he said, these are repressed memories, Nicole. And I'm like, well, why are they coming up now, 19 years later? I mean, really? And he said, because your body finally feels safe and you have resources around you now, and you have a support system, not my family, mind you, but you have built a support system that you can now process this, because what you have been through was so traumatic that you had not been able to recall it before. So after realizing, the events that he was making a sexual assault on me again in the car, which is why I said no and moved his hand, and he was speeding and he took the wheel of the steering wheel, and just, since he was so angry at me, he just spun it around. And that's when the car fishtailed. My side of the car hit the boulder, moved the boulder, flipped the car over, and I landed in a ditch, dead. So what I didn't realize at that time was I was so afraid of men's anger, because I thought if I got them angry in my brain, they could literally do me harm in terms of killing me. So I could not sustain any kind of relationship, and wound up not getting married until I was age 40, because my memory didn't come back until 19 years later, 36 years old. So now I knew what my issue was with men, and that people pleasing identity. I had to start dismantling that and get rid of that. So now I'm in recovery for people pleasing.
I think a lot of us need recovery on that.
So anyway, what I remember is I flew out of the car. I got stuck in the memory up in the air because I knew I was going to die. And Angel James came and took me to the other side, and it can be heaven, whatever you want to call it. It's a place that is more beautiful than you can ever imagine. And it is, you're in soul form. So when you die, we're all energy, and we have an energy body. And on death, it cracks open and your spirit flies out. So that's why I don't ever remember the pain associated with the accident because my soul left before I actually hit the ground. And that actually happens with a lot of traumatic accidents in NDEs. Their spirit will leave them before they actually feel the physical pain of what happens. Now, there's no pain on the other side. There's no negativity. There's no judgment. You're not alone, but you're in your soul self. So you don't have eyes like we have eyes that have a narrow vision and a little bit peripheral. Like you can see 360 all the way around you all at one time in soul form. You get messages through vibration and telepathy. So I heard two angels next to me, and they were talking about how important it was that we, meaning us humans on earth, ask them for help. There's a whole host of angels and spirit guides on the other side waiting to be asked to help us. We have to initiate the asking of help because of something called free will. They will only intervene unless it's an emergency. Like in my case, it was life or death. And so that's one of the messages I want to remind your listeners about is ask your angel, get to know your angels. All of us have at least one guardian angel, but most of us have a team of angels around us. And it takes a while to get to know them because it's a relationship, just like any other one. You have to spend the time to get to know them, but start asking for their help. I asked for help before this podcast to say, okay, angels, what is it that these people, Heather's audience and my audience need to hear? Be with Heather and help her to ask the right questions and me to have clarity in responding. So I ask them for a lot of things, and they never get tired because they don't have an ability to have a deficit energy, and even something as simple as a parking space. I know people laugh at me when I talk about that, but it's true. They will give you the evidence, and it might not be how you think it's going to be. That's what you have to suspend your disbelief about, but they are real and they do want our help. And the other message was, Nicole, he told me, you're going to go back. And I was like, no, oh, no. I do not want to get in that mangled body. I do not want to suffer and be in pain physically, more or less mentally dealing with what I'm going to have to deal with. And he told me my message was to tell people not to be afraid of death. And I'm like, that's a pretty big message. I mean, death is a pretty big topic to begin with.
Right.
So to break it down into bite-sized pieces, holy moly. So the next 20 years after my memory came back, I have been working on myself to get myself in alignment so I can be grounded and be, aligned with my body, my soul, my mind, and my spirit, that I could now finish my book, which took 13 years to write. And I can now articulate, knowing I don't need validation from anybody. I know this happened, and I know this is my truth, and it coincides with almost everyone else that's had an NDE experience. It's not the doom and gloom that writers typically write about, the negativity and the depression. It's absolute beauty. It is light, this loving white light. There's loving kindness on the other side, and there's this peace that passes all understanding. So we have no reason to fear death. Most of our fears are irrational, and we can talk more about fear later, but there's also 10 other lessons that I talk about that are important lessons, because we can start practicing those lessons here today. You do not have to die in order to understand and to practice what these lessons are. And if we start doing that now, the vibration of the world is going to help increase, and we're all going to be able to love and get along with each other. And we're not going to have to be needing wars, which are, when people say God, it's in the name of God that this war started, they're totally misusing God. That God is not starting a war and never has. It's always been man, and it's been religious institutions and theology that has caused us to have a duality with a picture of God. And that's how I was raised. And when I got over to the other side, I saw that God was just love. God was not dual. He was not bad. He was not judging. He was not critical. The wrath of God was not coming on me. I'm not going to hell for being a bad girl, or there's no such thing as being a sinner or original sin. That's all man-made bullshit, excuse my language, to keep people in fear. Because if you keep them in fear, they're going to not make, they're not going to have clarity, Heather, and they're not going to make decisions for themselves that are in their highest and greatest good, because the fear is sabotaging the prefrontal cortex, which is your ability to make executive reasoning decisions, looking at something from all views instead of from a fight, flight, fear, amygdala perspective, survival mode experience.
Well, I think that's very reassuring because there's a lot of people that fear death and they just want to hear that, that reassurance that you gave them, that you're absolutely sure that it's wonderful on the other side.
Oh, it's beyond wonderful. I didn't want to come back and I tried to go back a couple more times, And the other thing is you're never alone. People fear being alone. And I will tell you, you're not alone on earth either. It's just, there's a veil between us and the spiritual dimension, but your angels are always with you. Your deceased loved ones, you can connect with them. You don't need a psychic or a medium to do that. You can just ask for them to reveal themselves or ask a question, but you have to be open. They're not going to come in physical form. So you have to be open to this spiritual form that comes in many different signs, whether it's electricity going on and off, or whether it's a song you hear, whether it's through another human. The angels give you messages in many different ways, but you have to stay open and receptive to that. But you will see your deceased loved ones on the other side. You will not have the relationship from a human perspective that you had with them on earth. So if they were abusive here, that was not who their soul really was. That is who they became during experiences and filters put on them and whatever else. So you have that. We get spiritual amnesia on this planet. We forget who we really are at our core, which is our soul, which is perfect, radiant, glorious, eternal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we have to remember. At our core, that's who we are. And so we're not alone. And when you pass, these deceased loved ones, angels and guides, even your pets, okay, your pets are going to be on the other side. So
Yay.
Some of us love our pets more than we do people. So rest assured they will be over there, okay? These living, breathing, beautiful creatures who provide most of us unconditional love. So that's another message to help reassure people. But in my book, I do have a checklist about what typical fears are. People fear you're going to die in pain. Death is not painful. The process leading up to it can be painful depending on what your diagnosis is or how things happen. But part of the preparation for death is how you want to die. And you need to make sure that you have it documented and that everyone in your family is on the same page with what your needs and wants are. And most of us don't do that. Most of us just think it's not going to happen, and we put it off until we think we're going to be 80 or 90, and then we still put it off. And it winds up fracturing people when you pass, fracturing relationships in the family. And most of them never heal because they're fighting about material possessions or what your intention really was, or maybe you had a DNR, but then something happens at the last minute and they all want you to stay alive and not honor your DNR. So there's a lot of things that people have to talk about, need to talk about. And it's such an unpleasant topic, a morbid topic. We just don't want to go there, but we need to change that and start integrating that in at a much younger age.
And of course, we're learning through these near-death experiences just how beautiful it is when we cross over. And I've got a lot more questions for you. And I want to talk more about some of the things in your book. But let's go ahead. We'll take that into part 2. And for those of you listening, if you've enjoyed this, if you have some comments, we'd love to hear what you have to say. And also give it a thumbs up, give it a like if you're enjoying this conversation. Thank you, Nicole.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining me on Beyond with Heather Tesch. That was part 1. Make sure to listen to part 2. And if you liked what you heard, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more episodes.